Content warning. This episode is a discussion surrounding the murder of Brianna Ghey and the transphobia that contributed to her death. While there will not be description of her injuries, there will be reference to upsetting evidence in the trial, and heavy themes are present throughout this episode. Keep yourself safe.
She was absolutely full of life. She was such a character. She was really, really outgoing. And she loved attention. She loved to be on TikTok. She loved having all of the likes that she used to receive, and she was like life and soul of the party, really. Everybody knew Brianna, and anybody who ever met Brianna would never forget her.
Welcome to Hell Island Reports. I'm Kay. On the 11th of February 2023, a 16-year-old trans girl, Brianna Ghey, was murdered in a park in Cheshire by a boy and a girl, both 15 at the time. This episode, we're speaking to Jess O'Thomson, legal researcher and writer. They were present for much of the trial and sentencing of the boy and girl, now convicted of killing Brianna Ghey. And we'll be discussing the role of transphobia within the case, its role in the media, and wider implications for the trans community. This interview was recorded before Rishi Sunak's newest set of dehumanising comments in the House of Commons, which has sparked a backlash due to Brianna Ghey's mother, Esther, being present in Parliament at the time. As such, there is no reference to these comments and their fallout in this interview. I asked Jess, after covering the trial and sentencing, what the experience was like.
It was incredibly difficult during the trial itself, in particular, because basically the way that reporting works on an ongoing trial is you're not allowed to add any sort of comment or thought when you report onto the material you hear in court. You kind of just have to repeat it verbatim to avoid contempt of court, because the idea is that anything you publish might have an impact on the jury's decision making. So you can't publish anything that could influence the jury in coming to its verdict. And we heard pretty early in the case when Jolyon Moram of the Good Law Project had tweeted something about the transphobia in relation to the case and had linked it to the transphobia in the press. The police got in contact with him over that because the court had deemed that was, potentially contemptuous. And so I think I felt incredibly isolated and also kind of gaslit by the other reporting, because I was sat in court every day hearing how vulnerable Brianna was because she was trans, and hearing the transphobic messages between the defendants, which, as we know, were quite extreme, and then not being able to call that transphobia in public, not being able to talk about my thoughts in relation to it whatsoever, and then seeing other reporters basically pretend that stuff which had been said in court hadn't been said. And there was nothing I could really do to challenge or combat that, except for, continue to report on what I was hearing. So yeah, it was a very difficult and stressful experience, and also very isolating, I'd say. Well, I think there were kind of two reasons why I wanted to do that, The first was so that there could be someone who could report on this stuff accurately. Right, in that I didn't trust, and correctly so, as it's been proven, I didn't trust the rest of the press to report accurately on any what I considered at the time potential, but now clearly transphobia in the case. But I think also to report sensitively, so I was, for example, I chose not to dead name Brianna, unlike a lot of the other coverage. I intentionally left out a lot of the particularly upsetting stuff we heard in court about Brianna's injuries from the pathologist, which other sort of, in-depth reporting repeated uncritically.
Yeah, no, I think that's sort of a very valuable perspective, particularly as I suppose this is sort of the first high-profile sort of murder of a trans person in the UK that has received this much coverage. Having that kind of sensitive lens to view it has been important for a lot of people. Yeah, you mentioned it a little bit ago, but in terms of the actual transphobia that was entered into evidence, the messages between the two now convicted, what, without going into too much.
So the messages between the pair were incredibly dehumanizing towards Brianna, particularly from the male defendant, although the female defendant did also, for example, comment on Brianna's genitalia. The male defendant referred to her exclusively as an it, called her an unnatural creature. And I think, perhaps more upsettingly, and, a sort of big warning for the upsetting level of this material is when they talked about killing her and they were planning her killing, the boy said he wanted to see whether she would scream like a man or a girl. It's very clearly transphobic, and not just transphobic, but explicitly trans-misogynistic.
The disconnect between some of the evidence that you were tweeting about and the way a lot of it was then later framed by a lot of the mainstream press is quite hard to stomach. I mean, how has that come across in both their sentencing and the statements made by Esther during sentencing?
Yeah, so I think the press has had to admit this now because it has been made so explicit in the sentencing remarks. The judge concluded that, not only did transphobia play a role in the killing of Brianna, but it was in fact, in part, a motivation for her murder. There has been some reporting that this was only said on part of the male defendant. Whilst it is true that it certainly was the male defendant who primarily held that motivation, the judge has also concluded in her sentencing remarks that, this is a murder that they both participated in jointly and that they both knew of each other's motivations. And so, it could be considered that that was also, that transphobia was on the minds of both defendants, not just the male defendant. When giving an impact statement, a victim impact statement in court, Esther Ghey, Brianna's mother, explicitly said that her daughter was killed because one of the defendants hated trans people, and the other thought it would be fun. So, yeah, we've seen this quite clearly and explicitly. The CPS, the Crown Prosecution Service, have explicitly referred to this as a transphobic hate crime. And so a lot of the press has now had to report what they denied initially, which is the key role of transphobia in this case and in the murder of Brianna. It stands in direct contrast to a lot of the statements we've seen from prominent gender critical figures who have claimed that, Kathleen Stock claimed that the judge had ruled out transphobia as a factor. And, that was just completely made up at the time. But it certainly is clear how false that statement is now, that the judge has explicitly concluded that transphobia was a motivation for the murder.
Is this a new legal precedent in terms of finding that as a motivation? Is this sort of a high watermark for at least the legal understanding of transphobia and its consequences?
I'll be honest and say I the problem is I'd need to be a criminologist really to be able to comment on that in terms of, I'm sure there are a lot of cases all the time where we hear these sorts of statements, maybe not necessarily just in relation to transphobia, but into relation to other protected characteristics, where the judge concludes that the messages between defendants in planning a crime is part of their motivation. But I think this is certainly the most high profile example of this. I think statistics show that transphobic hate crimes are significantly on the rise, and I think this case is not necessarily demonstrative of what most transphobic hate crime looks like, but what it is a sort of exemplar of just how dehumanizing transphobic language can be, these attitudes can be, and how they can help facilitate something as serious as the brutal and sadistic murder of Brianna Ghey.
In terms of kind of the media environment that Brianna's murder kind of exists in, I suppose I already know your answer, but what are your thoughts on the way that a lot of the coverage has come about, and kind of what it demonstrates about current attitudes towards trans people and specifically the murder of one? Because I'd perhaps naively hope that there would be a point of reflection for some people here. Do you think that in any way that has come about, or this is just another thing that happened?
I don't think we'll see any reflection whatsoever, in the most disappointing possible way, but based on how I've seen this case reported, astonishingly there has been absolutely no introspection whatsoever from apparently the vast majority of the press as to how they report these kind of things. I mean, we can see that just from how post-sentencing and post the revealing of the killers' names, the press has chosen to continue reporting on this in a way that, almost true crime, the true crimification I've described it of this case. The way, they have plastered pictures of the killers over the front pages, have focused disproportionately on the motive of the female defendant in this case, rather than on the transphobia in their reporting. They focused on her sadistic washing of apparently red room videos, which, don't exist. These kind of things they have chosen to focus on, rather than on, as we already know, the other motive in this case that the judge concluded was a motive, which is transphobia. So it's incredibly disappointing to see that, but I think it tells us, I think it tells us that we cannot expect the media to be sensitive in its reporting of trans issues ever, even when it comes to something like this. I'm glad to see that I have not seen outright explicit front page denials of the role of transphobia in this case, attempts to reject and fight the judge. I think that would have made this a lot more upsetting than it already is. But it was, of course, we did see those kinds of things prior to the sentencing, prior to it being made explicit by the judge that was the case. So, for example, in The Guardian, there was an article by journalist Helen Pidd, I believe their Northern correspondent, which said why the police ruled out transphobia as a motive. Well, we now know for a fact that transphobia hasn't been ruled out as a motive, can't be ruled out as a motive, has been concluded to be a motive. So seeing reporting like that is obviously incredibly disappointing. But I don't think it's something we can be surprised by. There's certainly a monetary incentive to report on it in these true crimey ways. I imagine the press has done quite well out of its reporting on this case. The Mail has a podcast and a documentary now on the killers. So I think the coverage has been quite cynical, really. And whilst I felt quite upset and gaslit, as I said earlier, by the way it was reported, by the explicit denial of transphobia, that doesn't sell quite as well as framing these two as, unique monsters for whom the press and society and more generally has no responsibility whatsoever.
Yeah, I suppose that kind of falls into a broader canon of sort of white cisgender heterosexual killers who are kind of just sort of labelled as madmen, and there's no further introspection required culturally in that regard. What did you make of the decision to name the two convicted? Because I thought that was an interesting, to put it charitably, interesting choice, and it just felt strange from my legally uneducated position. I don't know what your thoughts are on that.
Okay, so I'm actually more understanding about this than I otherwise would be, because I understand the legal context here. As you can tell by my decision not to use their names whilst I've been talking to you, you know what I think about focusing on the killers and their names and their identities. I don't think it's something the press should be doing. I think it's harmful. But I understand why the judge came to the conclusion that she did, that the killers should be named at sentencing. And that is effectively because what happens with the kind of order that was preventing the naming of the killers is that it expires automatically when the defendants turn 18. And so that's in about 18 months' time. So what would have happened if the judge had decided to leave the order in place is that what we've seen happen over the last few days would have just happened anyway and again in 18 months' time, right? It would have been a whole extra news day for the press to talk about this in the way they have again. So I think the idea was, from the judge's perspective, and this is the reasoning she gave in her decision in lifting the order, is that it's better to get, for the defendants, for their welfare, to get it all out of the way, to have it all happen at once, and for the press to move on, right? And then they can begin their rehabilitation. They can begin getting on with the next 20 years of their life that will be spent in prison, at least. It saves the next 18 months being wasted by the anxiety of waiting for this to happen, by, the anticipation. So I understand from a legal perspective why that ruling was made. But I think that doesn't excuse the way the press has chosen to report on it, by the Mail documentary, which talks about their family lives and backgrounds and things, in some sort of talking to a child psychologist, in some sort of talking about lockdown and how it could have impacted them, in some sort of twisted attempt to dig up the real motive of the killers. I don't think it excuses any of this press circus, but I understand why, from a legal perspective, the decision was made.
On Sunday, the 4th of February, Esther Ghey, Brianna's mother, gave an interview with Laura Kuenssberg on BBC One. In this interview, she called for a ban on social media being available for anyone under the age of 16, as well as software that would link a child's phone to their parents in order to flag concerning searches made on that phone. This would have flagged searches made by the two convicted to their parents, as well as stopped Brianna from accessing social media sites that contributed to her vulnerable state. These calls come alongside Esther's existing campaigning for mindfulness to be taught and practiced in schools. In the days since Esther's interview, there has been discussion about her proposals, both within the trans community and without. I asked Jess about their perspectives on this.
I have complete sympathy for Esther Joy. I understand why. You know, when something like this happens, you can try and seek out an answer, you know, something you can do to make sure this never happens to anyone else's child ever again. I will, you know, I have absolutely no disrespect towards Esther whatsoever. She is one of the most impressive human beings I've ever encountered. The level of compassion she has shown to the family of the killers, I think, shows that. And the clear way in which she supported and loved her trans daughter, I think, you know, has stood out to all of us. I think, you know, a lot of us in the community wish we had had mums like Esther Joy. So yeah, I hold no anger to her whatsoever. But I think she's mistaken in this being her focus. So we know the killing was planned between the two over WhatsApp, but it could have easily just as easily planned over text messages, you know, SMS back in the year 2000 or whatever. It could easily have been planned that way. There was nothing unique about social media in this case, except perhaps for the fact that Brianna herself was on TikTok, you know, but loved it and had a great following on there. Though, you know, I believe there is some indication, I'd have to double check, but I believe there is some indication from her peers that there was some bullying of her on social media for being trans. But that I don't think is necessarily, you know, unique to social media. Bullying is just, it happens to happen on social media because that's where kids are. If kids weren't on social media, then the bullying would just happen elsewhere. So I think my main concern is that the focus on mobile phones and social media is incorrect in where it apportions the harm and the blame here. There are really serious concerns over social media, particularly moderation of social media, I would say. I know just in reporting on this case, I have had to leave social media because of the level of vitriol I have been subjected to, including death threats, over just talking about this case and talking about the transphobia in this case. But I think what removing social media access from young people does, and, you know, moderating very strictly the kind of information they're able to access, is it does in fact make them more vulnerable, especially for young queer people whose only access to information about their community, their identity, is often through the internet. So I think, you know, it's I understand the instinct, but we're talking about the wrong problem in doing that. We need to be talking about the wider normalization of transphobia, of hatred, and the way that children like Brianna are left so vulnerable by a lack of, you know, tackling the kind of bullying she received, by providing appropriate support, by challenging these kind of transphobic narratives that we see and that motivated her killers. So yeah, I think it's very easy to try and find a single scapegoat problem, which if we fixed it, then every child would be safe. But I don't think excluding access to social media entirely is going to keep kids safe. If anything, I think it's going to make a lot of them more at risk.
Yeah, it was a very moving interview, and yeah, the way she came across in that was very impressive. But I mean, yeah, as a trans person, the sort of my first thought coming away from the interview was this, if that were to be enacted as part of the online safety bill or whatever, then that would mean that so many online queer spaces that like my first reaction was just I wouldn't know I was trans if that kind of thing went through, and it did feel like understandable but slightly mistaken pivot, as you said. Where perhaps a redundant question, where do you think kind of the country as it is goes from here? Is it, I don't want to be too bleak, but like does everyone except trans people just kind of forget the role of transphobia in this case, write it off as, you know, a couple of insane children, and then just carry on? Is there, both for the sort of mainstream media and also within trans-centered culture, how do you think both groups kind of move forward from this?
You're asking me how I think they should or how I think they will?
We could do a bit of both.
Okay, we'll start with will. I don't think anything will happen of meaning. Maybe I'm just a cynic. It comes from being a hate researcher, I think. It tends to remove your optimism quite swiftly.
Yeah, it'll do that to you.
Yeah, no. I worry that there will be just attempts to engage in surface level censorship, and hope that fixes all the problems, when in reality, as I've identified, I think it will make the problem worse. It certainly already plays into certain political tendencies that are quite common, right-wing talking points over, for example, pornography, that kind of thing. I think it plays quite nicely into those narratives. And so it may be that it is taken up as part of that broader sort of movement and tried to be weaponized to enact, censorship and denial of access to important resources for children. I've seen some stuff already suggesting all of this might be to do with screens in schools, and that if we can remove screens from children's lives, then everything will be fine. I don't obviously think that's true, but that is broadly where I expect this to go. In terms of where I think it should go, and I think this is where the trans community needs to be very vocal and very active on this issue, is not focusing on how we can stop the killers or whatever, because frankly, I don't think any criminologist, anyone has ever demonstrated realistically how we can prevent all crime. I think what we need to be focusing on is how we make sure that it's less easy for them to find victims. And that means keeping trans children safe. And the way we do that is, we tackle bullying, we tackle the normalization of transphobia and transphobic language. Brianna was incredibly isolated, and as we heard from Esther Jai in court, believed that the female defendant was her friend who had befriended her, and Brianna was killed because she went to go and meet what she thought was her friend in a park. I think part of the reason why Brianna was in that position is because, and it certainly seems clear to me on the evidence, the reason why Brianna was selected as a target by the pair is because she was so vulnerable, because she was isolated and was desperate for that kind of friendship. So I think, tackling bullying, providing material resources to trans children to ensure that they are supported, that they have appropriate, medical care, mental health support, that's true for all children. But, I think as a trans community, we can focus on just how vulnerable Brianna was because she was a trans young person in an incredibly transphobic society, and that those facts are what made it easier to kill her. So we can work, I think, on making trans children safer. That would be what I would hope comes out of this.
No, that's a really nice perspective. What's next for you? Both in terms of what will you do and what should you do, I guess, but what are you up to next?
So I have a piece coming out about, entirely unrelated to this, about Lawrence Fox and the Lawrence Fox verdict, and what the queer community can learn from that. But I have also been working on and intend to continue working on a more sort of reflective essay on Brianna and the role of transmisogyny in her death and in society's sort of wider reaction to it, and resisting what I fear have been some very understandable but harmful instincts from the community, that the solution to this problem is to paint these two children, who I don't disagree are culpable for their actions, but to paint them as sort of unique monsters who should be locked away forever with the key thrown away, and that they should have gotten a whole life order, that they should have got a longer sentence, and that those kind of instincts, which I fear miss the wood for the trees somewhat, and I don't think are going to keep anyone safe. Certainly won't keep other children who are incarcerated safe. I think I want to urge the community somewhat to reflect on what extent they are looking for harm reduction or what extent they are looking for revenge.
No, that sounds really interesting. Thank you for, thank you for putting yourself out there as much as you have, and sort of sticking your head above the parapet. Because I think it has been extremely valuable to, I think, a lot of people.
Thank you.
Thank you to Jess O'Thomson for their time. You can find them on Twitter at Jess O'Thomson, that's JessOthomson, and jessothompson.co.uk. You can find more from Hell Island Reports on Twitter and Instagram at Hell Island Reps. Our usual music is Mindbreak.018M by the wonderful Free99. You can find their work on Bandcamp and Newgrounds. Thank you for listening. Take care of yourself, and if you can, someone else. More reports to follow.